Welcome everyone for joining today's webinar. It's great to bring the Concordia community together so we can discuss U.S.-China relations with Concordia Leadership Council member Ambassador John Negroponte, and then his colleague, Mr. John Holden from Concordia as well, and then of course Concordia advisor Sam Vinograd. Before we get started, and turn to the conversation that Sam will be moderating, I want to take a moment to ground this discussion in Concordia's mission of strengthening and supporting the partnering ecosystem. And now is a critical time for cross-sector collaboration, especially as this world is dealing with the coronavirus. And Concordia is reaffirming its unwavering commitment to maintaining its position as the leading nonpartisan voice alongside the UN General Assembly. And this year, September 21st through the 25th, Concordia is planning to host its largest and most inclusive forum and the 10th annual Concordia Summit. It's going to be our 10th this year, which we're very pleased to be doing. Unfortunately, we have to do it digitally, but we are going to be designing influential and substantial programming dedicated to the global response to COVID-19's impact and immediate devastation and aftermath. And I encourage anyone here on this conversation today to get in touch with Kevin Wenzel, our Director of Global Programming, if you want to be part of the programming process this year. And again, lastly, before I turn over to Sam, just a few Zoom housekeeping tools or tips. Attendees are going to be automatically muted upon entry, and we encourage you to announce yourselves in the chat feature on the right-hand side. And we encourage you to submit questions throughout the conversation, and we'll be getting to those at the end, and I'll be help moderate the Q&A at the end. And lastly, this conversation is being recorded, so the beginning part of the conversation will be recorded. The Q&A is a membership benefit only to our members here. So we won't be including that. And so with that being said, I will turn this over to Sam.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be on this panel. And my name is Sam Vinograd. I served in the Bush and the Obama administrations, and now I am a CNN national security analyst and have been spending a whole lot of time analyzing the U.S.-China relationship on air. So I'm thrilled to be here today and to analyze some of the strategic and tactical issues with two of the most brilliant thinkers around when it comes to U.S.-China relations. I've really been struck by the fact that China has become a political football at the moment, which is not unusual in an election cycle. But China is a word on both candidates' lips. Both candidates are quite focused on trying to paint the other as soft on China. And from a news perspective, there was a heavy focus on the election security assessment that the intelligence community issued, I believe it was on Friday, which indicated that China is engaged in influence operations because they do not want to see President Trump elected. So writ large, China is being used somewhat as a political piñata at the moment, while there are real strategic issues that we really need to consider when it comes to the US-Sino relationship. Again, both strategically and managing the rise of what's still called a rising power versus the United States, which is often referred to as a status quo power. So there's the strategic issues for us to discuss during this panel today, as well as the tactical issues. I don't know about you, Ambassador, and you, John, but not a day really goes by when I don't get a Twitter alert about some new round of punitive measures that either the US or China is rolling out against each other. That's been the norm really since COVID-19 broke out. And then finally, add to that, and we'll discuss that today, really interesting internal dynamics within China. Here in the United States, we often view China just in relation to the United States, when in fact, there are political, economic, social, and other developments underway, not to mention, of course, the really abhorrent treatment of Muslim minorities in China. So with all of that, there is a lot of ground to cover, and we only have about an hour, so we'll try to get through as much of it as we can. And I thought that perhaps what we do, if it works for my two co-panelists, is start with the macro and then dive into some of the more specific issues. So I'm going to ask Ambassador Negroponte a very easy question to kick off. Ambassador, yesterday, Secretary of State Pompeo, I believe it was in an interview with Matt Schlapp from CPAC, Pompeo cited what he called 50 years of failed policy toward China. So my opening, not softball question to you is, has US policy toward China failed over the last 50 years?
Right, and I didn't see that particular interview, but I read his speech that he made at the Nixon Center, I guess it must have been a week or two ago, where he sort of made the same point or points. And I don't think that would be a fair statement. A lot of water has gone under the dam, but we got to remember back then in 1970s when Nixon and Kissinger made their opening to China, we're emerging from a period of enmity with China. We, in fact, fought against the Chinese on the Korean Peninsula barely a year or so after the People's Republic of China was established. So we emerged from a period really of hostility for the first 20 years. And then we had the next 40 years, I think, one of relative harmony, starting out with a move really designed to establish some kind of strategic balance with the Soviet Union. But then I think pretty much to everybody's surprise, China's economy ended up accelerating so rapidly that we now find ourselves after these 40, 50 years with China being second largest economy in the world and all the attendant issues to that. And I think since 2012, really, since the advent of President Xi Jinping, we have reverted back to a more, I wouldn't say hostile relationship, but certainly there are frictions, and it's not the positive sum game or the win-win situation that the Chinese like to talk about. So we're in a new, I don't think you can say the policies failed. I think we did what was in our best judgment at the time. And there are a lot of benefits that have accrued from the relationship with China, mind you. But we have now new circumstances, and we're trying to manage this issue that you mentioned of the rising power, considerable unfair competition on the part of China, and how do we deal with that going forward? So we're confronting a new situation we're going to have to deal with.
Thank you for that, Ambassador. And you just mentioned 2012 and the arrival of Xi Jinping, not really the arrival because he had played a role before that time, but his elevation within the Chinese Communist Party in 2012 and the larger role that he started to play globally based upon that new title and domestically. And John, I want to ask you about the domestic dynamics a little bit. We talked the other day, and it is a seemingly American syndrome where, again, we just view everything through the prism of how we see another country. Can you tell us a little bit about what has changed under Xi Jinping and what's happening internally within the Chinese system? And does that in any way explain their external posture?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And if you will permit, I'd like to just offer a footnote to John's excellent comments about the history. You know, I think if you look back, there are times in U.S.-China relations where you would have said, gee, I think we should have done some course corrections or pushed back in certain ways. It might have turned out a little bit differently. Just imagine going back to when Deng Xiaoping came into power and the country was looking to reform and opening. It's hard to imagine us saying, oh gosh, we don't agree. We don't want you to go down the road of the market economy. We don't want you to open up. We don't want you to reform, and we're not going to play with you. That's pretty inconceivable. So that has to be borne in mind. I would strongly disagree with the characterization that our policy has been wrong for 50 years. But to your question, yes, it's very, very important to recognize that domestic politics trumps all. And it's true basically in every country. And if your domestic policies work well overseas, that's terrific. If they don't and they're important, well, that's too bad. But let's go back a second to what had happened. I'd like to recall an anecdote. In 2002, I was with a senior delegation meeting with Jiang Zemin, and he said to us, well, you know, my successor will be Hu Jintao, and he was selected by Deng. I'll make sure that this transition goes very, very well. And we know that the follow-up was that Jiang stayed very, very influential, stacked the standing committee with his own people, in a sense, constrained the freedom of action of Hu Jintao for quite a long time. And then Xi Jinping comes along, and he's not been anointed by anybody. He has to compete for the job. And we know that in 2012, he disappeared from sight for 10 days. What exactly was he doing? One reasonable hypothesis is he was negotiating with the elders for greater reign, to put aside the two previous presidents, to keep them from interfering with him, so that he could get the party back on track. And remember, it was that year that Bo Xilai was arrested, Zhou Yongkang. There was a crisis in the Communist Party of monumental proportions. So this was a situation that he took advantage of. But so fast forward from that, you see a lot of things that flow from that political instability that arose from the very issue that Jiang told us was that he was going to manage perfectly. And better, by the way, he said he'd do a better job than Mao.
And so do you find that Xi Jinping, or how would you characterize internally, and then perhaps Ambassador will go to the external piece, and I can talk a little bit about that too, but how would you characterize the differences under Xi Jinping domestically within China? This is somewhat of a leading question, so you'll excuse me, but have we seen more of a crackdown on civil liberties, freedoms, and that sort of thing? Has that changed under Xi Jinping within China's borders?
Indeed, it has, and you know, China goes through cycles of repression and opening, of centralization versus decentralization. We've been in a very long secular period, longest in my memory. Now it's 8 years running of centralization of power and severe political repression, and that you have to assume that is done in response to a sense of threats. Exactly how the party quantifies those, we don't know, but certainly Xi has taken advantage of technology, for example, to create what some call a surveillance state. Certainly that's the case in Xinjiang. And he's taken steps in vis-a-vis Hong Kong that surprised many people. If you'd asked them 2 years ago, would this happen, they would have said, yeah, probably not. But he doesn't want to take any chances with what the Chinese call stability. And that means no challenges to the party's rule.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador, now that we talked a little bit about the internal dynamics, externally, it's interesting, you know, people ask right now, are we in a second Cold War with China? And we discussed the other day that that's a wrong metaphor to use for a number of reasons. One, because of our incredible codependence with China from an economic perspective and other issues. But explain as well why we can't compare what Russia was seeking to accomplish during the Cold War with what China is seeking to accomplish now. What are China's external objectives that we're seeing play out around the world right now?
Well, yeah, I think, first of all, you're right. The difference between the two situations, the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the current situation vis-a-vis China, I think in large measure is based on the fact that of the high level of integration between our two economies, whereas we had practically no integration whatsoever with the Soviet bloc. It was negligible. So, I mean, that's a very significant difference. It does raise the question, ultimately, of can one have a period of geopolitical tension and competition and what are the limits of that competition before it starts to really interfere with the economic interdependence. And I think we're already starting to see some impacts of that competition on our economic cooperation, which is, I think, beginning to diminish. On your question about what China's objectives are, of course, for a long time, they have protested that they have no hegemonic ambitions. Deng Xiaoping had his famous saying, somewhat the equivalent of hide your light under a bushel basket kind of statement, and that China was going to move quietly in the international scene. And I was able to see some of that personally when I was ambassador to the United Nations. China always kept a very low profile, even in the UN Security Council. They tended to keep their counsel, or they followed the Russian lead, but they never were that proactive themselves. I think today, many of the concerns that China has in the international realm are not that different from what they were before. Certainly the issue of Taiwan is primordial for the People's Republic of China, and I think they probably would view the current situation as one of increased tension between China and the international community on the subject of Taiwan. And I think it's been exacerbated by what's happened in Hong Kong. So I think managing their near abroad, particularly what they consider Greater China, is probably remains their single highest priority. But beyond that, I think they would like to reduce our influence, the United States' influence in the East Asia Pacific region. And I think that to some extent explains the territorial and jurisdictional disputes that they have both with the Southeast Asian countries in the South China Sea and with Japan over those islands. It's, again, asserting themselves with the ultimate view of eroding our friendships and alliances, creating tension there, and ultimately achieving some kind of predominance. Now, do their ambitions extend beyond? I think clearly beyond the East Asia Pacific region, I think they clearly do. But do they have some global hegemonic plan? I'm not so certain. I think their interests tend to be more sporadic in that regard from a geopolitical point of view. But of course, they do want to extend their influence economically as far and wide as they can. And that, I would say, is the underlying explanation of the so-called Belt and Road Initiative.
And ostensibly, there's cyber espionage as well when it comes to the economic dynamics.
Yeah, who doesn't do cyber espionage? I mean,
well, not all cyber espionage is created equal.
It could be, but it just you're getting me onto one of my favorite hobby horses here. Having been the first director of national intelligence. Yes. I think we got to spend much more time on defense with regard to these things. I mean, if they get us once, shame on us. If they get us more, or shame on them. But if they get us more than once, shame on us. And we've just got to build our cyber defenses better than we have up until to date, which includes a better relationship between the federal government, the intelligence community, and the private sector in this country.
I couldn't agree more. And having worked in the tech sector, and I worked at a large payments processor for a while, there have been some steps taken towards greater integration with DHS and the FBI and all those guys in the cyber working groups, but it's a drop in the bucket. So
yeah, and one of the problems, if I can interrupt you,
please,
because I was in some of these discussions, is the private sector is always waiting to see how much of the protection the government will pay for. And so some of these investments don't get made. And that's one of the problems we got.
Yes, and it's just been, as you mentioned, it's an ongoing problem. So whomever is occupying the White House from, January 17th, 2021 onwards, hopefully we'll make this a priority. John, when we think about our approach to China, when I worked under Obama in the first term, trying to engage on cyber espionage was a key focus. and I imagine under successive presidents, there's been this discussion about carrot versus stick, engagement versus punitive measures, and all of that. Is there a way to reasonably engage with China, realistically engage with China on these really hot button topics like cyber espionage, or even take something the ambassador just mentioned, quote unquote, greater China, issues that China believes are fundamental to themselves? Is there a way to do it differently that would be more effective?
Absolutely, there is. And I've never been an ambassador, and this should be John Negroponte answering your question, but really you're talking about identifying what are our core interests, figuring out what theirs are, managing the strategy of the relationship where you've got give and take. I mean, if something is critically important to us, let's figure out a way to negotiate a better result. And unfortunately, the current administration, we're not seeing that coordination function performed in the White House by the president. Since Richard Nixon, every American president has managed this relationship, and there's give and take. And we saw under Obama, there was a pledge made by the Chinese president, by Xi Jinping, not to stop the cyber espionage, right?
I remember, yes.
And a similar promise not to militarize the South China Sea. Now, did we follow up appropriately after those pledges were made? Did somebody drop the ball? I don't know. But yeah, you've got to talk, and you've got to be, I think, quite cold-blooded. Engagement and diplomacy is not about making friends. It's about it's about achieving results.
And kicking it back to the ambassador, are there any issues that we could be working with China on a transactional level? And what I mean by that is, while the bigger picture is frenetic right now, is there anything that we could be transactionally working on with the Chinese, or is that not the way that the Chinese are going to operate with us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if you have a particular subject in mind, but just to build on what John was saying, I mean, even during the darkest moments of the Cold War, we had various forms of dialogue with the Soviet Union. And when we didn't have dialogue, when we had periods of, no high-level summit or anything like that, we got worried, and we thought that, some kind of talks should be restored. So I think the idea that it's wrong to talk to your adversary or competitor or whatever, or enemy even, I mean, I was in the Vietnam peace talks, it is just wrong-headed, it seems to me. And in fact, if anything, where there are risks to regional or global peace is where you probably need the talks the most. So, I mean, if I were in the Oval Office or in the State Department at a high level, I'd be strongly advocating resume dialogue with China, both at the general level and at the particular level. I mean, I think the strategic political dialogue is important, but I think you can also talk about things at a lower level, whether it's avoiding incidents at sea or
deconfliction.
Deconfliction. Obviously it's a political issue now, but I thought that Mr. Obama and Xi Jinping reached some pretty good understandings on the climate issue back in I guess it was the summer of 2015, which led to the Paris, which was one of the factors contributing to the Paris Accord. And of course, this COVID issue was a natural for discussion, not only with China, but with the world as a whole. But this administration has chosen to pursue essentially a unilateral path, which I personally think is a mistake.
Sam, if I could
I'll just add quickly. Go ahead, John, and then I'll jump in.
No, I was just going to mention, both Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi were out in public Thursday and Friday with an outreach to open dialogue with the U.S. Of course, they realize that this administration is not going to respond. But if you read those speeches carefully, one thing to note, for example, is that the four core interests of China are identified as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang, not the South China Sea. All right, what does that mean? Does that mean that we should begin a multilateral process of negotiation with China over what these interests might be? Or do you do it bilaterally? I don't know, but there's an opening there potentially in a different administration.
That's really interesting. Thank you. The only point I was going to add is that engagement didn't used to be a dirty word. As you mentioned, Ambassador, we regularly engage with both allies and adversaries and rival powers, and it's key to keeping communication open. I think perhaps the issue has become, and this is my observation, my personal observation, that there has been a bifurcated approach to China under this administration, whereby we had several, if you will, China hawks. Secretary Pompeo has been quite aggressive in terms of his rhetoric on China. He's called the CCP an authoritarian regime for some time, versus President Trump, who has had a friendlier tone towards Xi Jinping personally on a range of issues. Those two those two tracks came together when COVID-19 broke out and we got closer to the election, in my assessment, when China became a political liability, particularly as the trade deal has not really given the benefits to U.S. farmers that it promised for a variety of reasons. And so now we're seeing those two pieces come together in a full court press from the administration to show how tough this administration is on China. And I do think that the administration has been tough in certain areas, leaving Trump to the side. And he is now trying to bolster his own bona fides for political reasons in the run-up to the election. And on the flip side, we have Vice President Joe Biden, who I'm supporting for president, who I worked with when he was vice president, who the Trump campaign is criticizing for, I think they were tweeting pictures out of Biden smiling next to Xi Jinping when she was vice premier, something like that. But it really, I bring it up because when I was in the White House, the idea was that we did have to talk to the Chinese in the same way we started negotiations for different reasons with Iran. The notion that not talking to someone was dangerous was certainly clear, but that talking in a responsible way, at least everything was out on the table. Now we're in a situation where when the president talks to someone, again, this is a personal judgment, whether it's Xi Jinping or Putin, that also often becomes a liability because it is not in line with what other members of his administration will say. I hope that whatever 2021 brings, we get back to more informed, realistic engagement from the Oval Office, whomever's president. And my last question to both of you is, what would you, whomever's occupying the Oval in let's say February 2021, what would your advice be when it comes to U.S.-China policy? Would you recommend a reset? Would you recommend more of the same? What would your advice be to the occupier of the Oval Office in 2021? John, maybe we'll start with you and then end with the ambassador.
Sure, thanks, Sam. Well, you know, the first thing is a strategic assessment of our interests, China's interests, their capabilities, our capabilities, and also an assessment of what our options are, given the fact that we have friends around the world, okay, in managing issues with China. So there's that assessment has to take place. Second, open the door for conversation with China. And lastly, listen to more people in the United States, listen to the business community, listen to other communities who have ideas and need to be taken into account. So you want to have an open door. Just a few brief suggestions there.
Yeah, just backing up 1 second to the campaign, I am fearful that there's, this sort of, I think we want to avoid a race to the bottom, if you will, as far as the U.S.-China relationship is, and that hope that they don't get into this business of trying to outdo each other in what they might do to China. I know that the Biden camp doesn't incline towards that, but I think they certainly moved more towards that kind of approach than they might have done in earlier years. As far as advice to what the new president or the re-elected president might do, I'd say, first of all, have a summit with Xi Jinping. I really believe that. Some people say, well, you shouldn't advocate summits unless you have them thoroughly prepared and everything else. but this is a case where I think in both countries, dealing with the top is important. Getting the right kind of messages coming from the top might help us manage some of the issues down below. Second, you're not going to win a competition with China without rebuilding our own country. And I think that is a key message that I think has to be emphasized. We got to rebuild our infrastructure. We got to, frankly, rebuild our alliances. And we have to work on new diplomatic approaches for dealing with China, finding regional partners, the ASEAN group of countries, Japan, India, and so forth, Europe. So that we try to develop some kind of common approach rather than going it alone, which I think will simply create opportunities for mischief on the part of China with other countries. So it's a holistic approach that's got to be taken, and it isn't just the diplomacy we have with China, but we have to have diplomacy with China as well. And I would certainly advocate strongly for that.
And just a follow-up question on that, we're going to turn to viewer or participant questions in a moment. So send your questions to the Q&A icon. But what we're describing on China and kind of U.S. perceptions of China or personal perceptions, are we part of a group of like-minded countries, Ambassador? And John, I'm curious to hear both of your responses to this. You mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, China's throwing medical gear all around the world to ameliorate COVID-19 related issues. Are we going it alone because the president has destroyed alliances, or are we going it alone because other countries are either more dependent on China or less convinced about the threat China poses? Ambassador, perhaps we'll start with you and then end with John before going to questions.
Yeah, well, I think actually the president probably says a lot of things, and Mr. Pompeo perhaps also, that other leaders might think but aren't going to say. I mean, there's an element of that.
Why won't other leaders say it? Because they're worried about the consequences?
Well, because
like Australia, for example, what we're seeing.
Conceivably, you could adduce a number of reasons, but one would be fearing some kind of economic consequence. Another is that it's not the diplomacy of a lot of countries to be provocative. They try to manage with a more nuanced approach. So I know there are a number of leaders around the world who have qualms about China's behavior, but they're just not going to express it in the way we do, which tends to be provocative. And also, I think in the case of China, because of their system, it evokes a rather sharp reaction on their part. So it's somewhere between being alone on some things, but not entirely. And I think that with a bit of effort, we could actually work quite effectively to reach a meeting of minds with a number of these countries. Exampled, as we said, India, some of the ASEAN countries. The Vietnamese have no particular love lost for China, but they're not going to gratuitously provoke China, being situated where they are geographically, right at their southern borders. So most countries, not being superpowers, are obliged to take a more nuanced approach.
And John, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think those are very wise words. And China's wolf warrior diplomacy and other things it's done over recent years have been aggravating to people in many countries, and they've lost. I think their soft power, as a result, has failed to improve. In fact, has probably declined. And so, and people have serious issues with China of the same sorts that we have. So, yeah, we have opportunities to create a global, some global guardrails, if you will, that may lead to some better outcomes with China.
Thank you.